Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pope-Rubin. Dahlia Lithwick has written a new book. It's rapturously reviewed, and it's called Lady Justice: Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. Dahlia is the senior legal correspondent at Slate and host of Amicus, Slate's award-winning biweekly podcast about the law. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, The New Yorker, Washington Post, The New Republic, Commentary, and many other places. Lithwick won a 2013 National Magazine Award for her columns on the Affordable Care Act, and she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in October 2018. Welcome, Dahlia Lithwick. It's so good to be with you.
Thank you for having me, Abby. It's a treat to be here.
So this is a remarkable book. Not only is it incredibly reported, but the timing in a way was prescient beyond your wildest imaginings. First, just tell us what made you want to write it at the time you started, which was pre-Dobbs decision, pre a lot of what I would say is some of the catastrophic. Let's just start with your timing as to why you decided to write this book when you did, without realizing just how much would have unfolded since you first began.
I mean, I think the sort of sad paradox is that I started this in 2017 when I thought things couldn't get worse. That I really believed that what I wanted to do with this book was write about a bunch of lawyers, particularly women lawyers, who looked around in 2017 and didn't wait to workshop ideas, who didn't wait until somebody said, oh, that's a good idea. We, all 10,000 of us discussed it and you should go ahead. They just pivoted and became, in my view, warriors for justice. And what I wanted to do with the book was really say, we win a lot. And sometimes we give too much credit to the forces of chaos, to the forces of just cruelty. And we forget that Donald Trump kept losing lawsuits more than any other president in modern history. And that's a thing to celebrate. And so I think what I wanted to do was really say, don't despair. We have this amazing set of tools, and these sorceresses, these women who have just amazing, meticulous power. And I think what happened is, we lost more in some sense. I mean, you mentioned Dobbs, but we lost a lot. And I still believe that we have access to these incredible tools. And so I think it went maybe from being a book about recent history and the ways in which women were at the vanguard of fighting for justice, democracy, equality, dignity, all those values. And in a way, after Dobbs, maybe it became a little bit of a blueprint for how to get ourselves out of what feels like even more intractable, horrific times.
And you've been a legal reporter for obviously decades and widely admired. And part of it is not just your deep reporting, but your candor and your humor. When you approach writing a book essentially focused on women on the front lines, did you worry about those who would say, why just women? Isn't that kind of arbitrary? And how do you justify a lens that looks particularly at what women did in terms of legal battles and, frankly, ingenuity and strategy at a time when, in those Trump years, there was clearly kind of, I would say, sexism not just run amok, but infiltrating policy and government and discourse?
I mean, I think the first half of the answer is, look, my own sons, I'm the mother of teenage sons, and both of them said, wait, where are the guys in here? There were a lot of guys. And I'm very, very careful in the introduction of the book to say this is not to the exclusion of the amazing men. And throughout the book, I talk about male litigators at the ACLU and other places who did phenomenal work. So I didn't want to hive off men as incidental, but I wanted to at least mull about, and the book is kind of a protracted meditation about this notion that women have a special relationship with the law, that there's something that they experience in their DNA that tells them that the law is a thing that is a weapon that can be used that's really, really potent and powerful. And that if the next best set of weapons are about violence and power, that's not something that's always available to women or interesting and attractive to women, but that the law has been, in my view, something that has really, with stutter steps, fits and starts, but helped make women extremely powerful in this country. And so what I wanted to do was really sit with the idea, and, this is the central thesis of the book, that women finally have reached parity in law schools. They have power in government, on the bench, and not nearly enough, but they've made massive strides. And if in that fact that is reflected in visceral, tangible, massive feelings of wins and power, then I want to think about why that is. And so in a sense, the book starts from the proposition that women didn't have access to the machinery of justice for most of American history, and certainly all of world history. Is something different happening when they get access to it? And can we think about that as something that is immutable for women, that they could continue to have access to it?
And you just mentioned the history that I think many people don't appreciate, that in 1873, the Supreme Court decided that women had no constitutional right to practice law. I mean, it's just unfathomable how baked in the exclusion was for so long.
Right. And we really see that in the right to vote, right? Women were fighting for the right to vote from the moment the 14th Amendment passed. And it's not an easy lift. And I think one of the things you said is so important, which is there's so much taking for granted at work, particularly, women our age or younger, who don't have a memory of what it was like to not be able to get a credit card unless it was in your husband's name or your father's name, who don't have a memory of what it was like to be one of 6, 7, 8 women in your law school class. And I think in some sense, the massive meteoric success of women using all these markers of equality is exactly the thing that made Dobbs so shocking, that made Trump's misogyny so shocking. The idea that we'd passed all that was long over. And it's so far in the rearview mirror that, it died with RBG. I think that has really been throttled in recent months. And so one of the things that I really also wanted to think about is, what does it mean to both take for granted that we've achieved these things and they're never going away, and then to have them ripped away and stand there saying, everything I thought I believed about the law and equality is not in fact true.
So I wish we had more time, but I want to just tick off some of the incredible stories that you profile. And I should tell viewers that what's wonderful about this book, I think, is that these are really stories of individuals that you get to care about and understand and know. And they're incredible, incredible portraits. But let's start with one that is, I think, sort of woefully unsung, Pauli Murray. I'm lucky enough to have been a Yale grad, and now obviously they're trying to right that omission, but very many years too late. So just tell us a little bit about Pauli Murray and why she's so important, why you start the book with her.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with Pauli Murray in some sense, from the deep sense of regret that you just invoked, which is, how is it possible that I went to law school and never once took a class on or heard about Pauli Murray? Because Pauli Murray was, in fact, the architect of almost everything that we now enjoy in terms of not just racial justice, but gender justice in the United States. Long before there was an RBG, there was a Pauli Murray. Before Thurgood Marshall was arguing Brown v. Board, Pauli Murray was building the structure of that argument in a law school paper. And so for me, Pauli Murray represents someone, as you say, who should just be lauded on her
Tell
own
us
merit.
just the basics of who she is, for those who don't know.
Yeah, Pauli Murray was an incredibly important and, I would say, luminous bright light in terms of thinking about using the 14th Amendment to create equality. And so before anybody else had thought of the idea of using the 14th Amendment to make school children equal on the basis of race, Pauli Murray thought about that. Pauli Murray was both Black and a woman. Pauli Murray was not admitted to the school of her choice because of her race, and then not admitted to the law school of her choice because of her gender. Pauli Murray, I should just note, probably would want to be referred to as they today, because Pauli Murray was definitely very, very much of the belief throughout her life that she was a man trapped in a woman's body. And there was no language for that at the time. And the reason I say Pauli Murray creates all this is that quite literally in a law school paper at Howard University, Pauli Murray writes out the thing that will become the spine of the argument that Thurgood Marshall uses in Brown v. Board. Nobody tells Pauli Murray. Nobody credits Pauli Murray. Years later, Pauli Murray comes to learn that this is her work. And by the same measure, in one of the seminal gender discrimination cases that RBG ends up bringing, she does credit Pauli Murray on the brief. But all of this is work that Pauli Murray had kind of carved out years before. And so one of the reasons I'm obsessed with Pauli Murray, as we both said, is because this is a person who is extraordinary. But for me, it's also really emblematic of who gets remembered and who gets written out of history. And the idea that only because there's an amazing documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray, by Julie Cohen and Betsy West, that I would absolutely commend to people. But you have to do this deep excavation of history to find out who actually changed history. And so I started the book with Pauli Murray as a way of saying we're all a little bit too in love with the idea that RBG single-handedly changed the world. RBG was the first person to say, and said to me in interviews multiple times, I stand on the shoulders of so many people who don't get credit. And so I thought a book about women lawyers should start from the vantage point of who are the people who don't get credit.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about just how difficult it is to kind of reorient us to a person who should be in the vernacular for so long. You know, it's almost hard to reteach ourselves to use this name that should be on all of our tongues. Let's fast forward to Sally Yates in the Trump administration. We remember she was summarily fired and a kind of a hero in her own right.
Yeah, I mean, Sally Yates to me is representative of somebody who was all too rare in the 4 years of the Trump era, somebody who just publicly and loudly said, nope, I won't break the law for you. And the idea that there weren't thousands of Sally Yates following Sally Yates is one of the central, I think, tragedies of the 4 Trump years. And so essentially, you know, Sally Yates found out about the travel ban, the Muslim ban.
What was her role?
She was the acting attorney general until Jeff Sessions was sworn in. And within days of inauguration, you know, the acting attorney general is supposed to just like sit around and have boozy lunches until they swear in the AG. But in fact, she was called upon to defend the Muslim ban that Donald Trump put into place within days of inauguration. She looked at it very carefully. It was not vetted by her Justice Department and said, I can't. I think this is rooted in religious animus. I think it violates due process. I've looked at it with my staff. I will not defend it in court. I will not put the imprimatur of the DOJ on it. And as you say, she was fired summarily by way of like an email. And I think that one of the things that I hold Sally Yates up to be in the book is as I said, somebody who there should have been many more of, people saying, this is a bright line, I shall not cross it. I'll lose my job before I do, but I'm not slinking away to write a bestseller. I'm in fact publicly saying this is wrong. But also that Sally Yates, for me, starts the book because she is white. She is a third-generation lawyer. She is from Georgia. She has all of the privileges of, you know, really important legal education and legal career, because I wanted the book to end on Stacey Abrams in Georgia, a Black woman who doesn't have all of the advantages and yet nevertheless changes the world. So for me, that move in the book from somebody who almost inherited this mantle of using the law to help redress injustice, and somebody who had to fight for it and yet still fights for it by organizing every day, it felt like a move I wanted to celebrate.
And then Rebecca Heller, she to me was on the younger side of, again, a kind of moxie that is often underestimated in terms of just the enterprise that she showed of like, this is something that I object to, and I'm going to actually marshal everything at my disposal, which wasn't a heck of a lot as a young student, to make a difference here. Tell us her story, if we can, just on one foot.
Becca Heller is a great character. As you say, if Sally Yates represents sobriety and gravitas and, you know, the sort of very somber idea of what the Justice Department stands for. Becca Heller is kind of foul-mouthed, very, very cynical about the law. And as you say, very young. She was the founder of IRAP, which was something she founded at Yale Law School that was a refugee assistance project that essentially incentivized young law students to get involved with law firms to do pro bono representation of refugees seeking to enter the United States. And she was kind of on the front line when that same travel ban came down. She found out about it a few days before, and she essentially put into place what I called the airport revolution. Lawyers running to the airports in the first hours of the travel ban, standing at arrivals with, placards that said in like Pushtu and Arabic, if you need a lawyer, I'm here, I will represent you. And again, I think it's so emblematic of how women organize, right? This was not sitting around talking to a bunch of people, getting a 6-month plan. This was someone should do thing.
It's just I'm going, I'm showing up.
And I'm creating a spreadsheet so that tax attorneys and the divorce lawyers around Virginia went running to the airports to represent refugees. And so for me, again, it's sort of the very best of us. People love to tell jokes about lawyers, and often deservedly so. But for me, Becca kind of reached out and asked for this generous spirit of lawyers to just show up. And if they did nothing else, stand up for the principle that you can't ban people based on religion at points of entry. And I love that people showed up and did it. So for me, again, it's a story of somebody who at some point in her chapter, Abby, she says, look, the law is bullshit. I'm just using the master's tools to take down the master's house. The law is sexist and racist. It's baked in. So she, again, is a diametric opposite from some of the lawyers that we talk about in the book, Anita Hill or Sally Yates or Vanita Gupta, who talk about the law in really lofty magisterial terms. And I wanted people to look at the different characters and see that they all have really complicated relationships to the law. And Becca, for me, is very much an avatar of the person who's like, look, this sucks, but I'm using it and I'm winning.
And what I also love, Dahlia, is that there's often we can write off activists, right? Unfortunately, as like it's so many protests and so many signs, and there's, all of the disparagement about sort of woke youth or woke millennials. And this book just reminds us of what it means to actually take action that has a result. I mean, and I'm not writing off protests. I grew up with protests, as you know, and I know how effective they can be. But sometimes I think there is now a default to saying it's only so much noise. And what your book just reminds us of is that there is this tool, as you say, that marshaled in the right way by the right people who care as much as these women do. It actually changes the game. I want to go to Robbie Kaplan and Charlottesville, because that's one of those examples where I still think so few people realize a case was won. And it was complicated how. So again, I know it's hard to condense, but just give us a sense of how Robbie did it.
Yeah, and I love that you're lifting up I think it was one of the civil rights trials of, our lifetimes. And the fact that folks don't know about it is one of the reasons I really wanted to surface it in the book. And maybe I'll just say parenthetically, I was living in Charlottesville at the time. This was very, very personal to me. And in the chapter, it's very clear that I was struggling with some of these issues of what is the line between free speech and protest and violence? What is the appropriate response when Nazis come to your town with flaming torches? So in effect, what happened is after August 2017, when white supremacists and Klansmen and Nazis famously marched in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Donald Trump memorably said there were very good people on both sides, Robbie Kaplan waited for the Justice Department to do an investigation and to bring action. And of course, Jeff Sessions' Justice Department did nothing of the sort. And so she was a sort of white shoe attorney who had just opened a kind of boutique practice called Kaplan and Hecker. And she famously was the person who fought for Edie Windsor to dismantle the Defense of Marriage Act. And she did that thing that you and I keep talking about. She just said, I guess if there's no lawyers doing this, I'm going to do it. And she and Karen Dunn, who was her partner in this amazing litigation, dusted off the KKK Act that essentially said you cannot commit acts of racially motivated violence to intimidate minorities. And it took years and years and years. They filed suit in the fall of 2017. The lawsuit did not go to trial until just about a year ago, but they had this tremendous successful litigation about the primary against the primary organizers and architects of the racial violence that ended up hurting many people, killing Heather Heyer in Charlottesville. And to me, again, I love this story. Partly, again, this was my hometown, and this was very, very much needed repair work, but also to tell a story of what it means when two women just look around and say, look, we have a statute. Everyone's telling us we're wrong. Everyone's telling us this is protected First Amendment speech, but we need to make people whole. We need to make this right. And we need to really send out a clarion warning to Nazis that they can't come to a town with guns and with body armor and terrorize the community. And so I think it's, again, another one of those wins that we kind of put in the rearview mirror as, well, whatever, everything sucks. Everything doesn't suck. A lot of that KKK Act litigation that they did is now being used against January 6th insurrectionists.
No, and I think that just because we're on JBS, Jewish Broadcasting Service, I want to just remind people this was the Jews Will Not Replace Us march. And that often, I think many of us, I'll speak for myself, we look at the spike in anti-Semitism and we look at just this groundswell that seems to be kind of gaining a certain fervor and think what could be done? Like what are the actual, what's the machinery of our country that can meet it, at least, if not eliminate it? And this was just, again, to me, a very optimistic chapter that sometimes we overlook as where justice was done, obviously, by these women who did not give up. You mentioned that Charlottesville was your home, and that's sort of a personal chapter for you. It's also a personal chapter when you go into Alex Kaczynski, the judge, who was kind of shockingly Me Too'd. I just remember when he was this untouchable, heroic figure when I was kind of coming up in journalism, and he was one of these revered judicial figures. If you can just give us a sense of just how that story played out and your particular personal lens on it.
I mean, this was a painful chapter to write because I really deeply hate writing about myself ever, but I had been in the midst of, again, this was that 2017 was just a kind of a crazy year. And as you say, Judge Kaczynski, he was on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's the biggest federal appeals court in the country. He was the chief judge, and he was justifiably revered. He is one of the most important, sort of legal thinkers and constitutional thinkers, and he was a juggernaut. He also showed porn to his law clerks. He also said and did inappropriate things with young women. And this was the case for decades, over decades of his judicial career. And for me, it wasn't so much a Me Too proposition as why is it that every journalist who covered him, including me, every woman who clerked on the Ninth Circuit, law professors, male and female across the country, all knew about this and nobody said or did anything. And so I wanted to think about it kind of as one of those Weinstein problems of complicity. And what does it mean when we all collude to keep a secret, knowing that young women are being hurt because it's good for our careers or because we feel like it's on someone else to step forward. And so the very, very short version is that several young women who are younger than I came forward that winter and said that this behavior, including showing really raunchy pornography, saying unbelievably inappropriate things had happened, and they were reporting it for the first time. And Judge Kaczynski initially belittled them and made it seem as though the claims were not true. And at some point, I came forward and said what I had known. And I think in the end, 14 or 15 women came forward in various outlets and all said what they knew. And he stepped down. But again, I wanted to think about it, particularly because the Brett Kavanaugh chapter comes after. But I wanted to think about what we do with these closed systems of power.
I just want to quote you, Dahlia, because it's wonderful. I kept my own Kaczynski story to myself for more than 2 decades. Everyone understands that keeping secrets is part of the bargain. What I thought was refreshing was that you were owning your own, I would say, understandable but honest complicity and just being part of something where you're benefiting in certain ways I think we've all been here, and you don't necessarily say, I'm the one who's going to put the brakes on or call out something that might actually write me out of those benefits or write me out of this kind of this inside bubble that I'm benefiting from on some level. I just thought that took courage, and it's something, frankly, that's a gauntlet for all of us to kind of, when do we cross that Rubicon?
Yeah. And I think that, in the years since, and I think I say this in the book, so many people, including federal judges, came to me and said, in a hushed conversation on a dais at an event, oh, I could tell you stories. And, I would never have let my daughter clerk for him. And so I think that the idea that we need to think about what it is to stand up for other people. And that I felt, as you said, very responsible for the fact that young women after me experienced abuse, in part because I didn't come forward. And to really think about what it is that we're doing in these closed systems where we just accede to the idea that, oh, well, everybody knows and there's nothing to be done, particularly because Judge Kaczynski was such a formidable actor in picking clerks that would go on to clerk at the U.S. Supreme Court. You had a whole bunch of women, including me, telling young law students, oh, don't clerk for him. Absolutely don't. It's not worth it. And then the act of sidelining all these amazing candidates, or them sidelining themselves, is another, I think, really important and urgent story about access to power.
And I really was moved by the way your son plays a role in this book about women, because he is clearly so engaged in your work, and he's following kind of your emotional trajectory through this disclosure and your piece and how it changed the game. But he's checking in with you. And I thought to myself, I have a brother, I have a son. It's so nice that your son is part of this story, that it's not like he's just on the sidelines. He's engaged in keeping track. And if you could just give us a snapshot of the call you asked if he could join with Anita Hill, because I thought that was particularly moving.
Yeah, it was incredibly powerful. He was just starting high school here in Brooklyn. He really sat with my family and I, both my sons did, when I kind of agonized about whether I was going to come forward with my own story. And I think I said in the book, as the story was about to go live on Slate, he called me and just said, you're going to be okay. Sometimes you have to tell your story so other women can tell theirs. It was so moving. And then a few days later, I convened a phone call with Heidi Bond and Emily Murphy, who were the two women who had come forward first, and with Anita Hill, who offered to just speak to the three of us. And my son was amazing. He just said, as says no high school boy ever, can I just sit quietly in this conference room where I'm sitting at the Slate Bureau? And when I introduced Anita Hill on the phone, I said, this is Heidi Bond, this is Emily Murphy. We all sort of feel as though we've just ended our respective careers, and my son is here in the room. And she said, put him on the phone. And then she just thanked him and said, because of young men like you, we're gonna build a better world. And trust me, Abby, he's lunched out on that story for many a year. But
he's entitled.
But it was just, again, one of those powerful ways in which I really think young people want to do justice in their bones. They see a clear arc that I think is muddy for us. And for me, him just jumping in and being there for me and being there for the other women and sort of hearing what Professor Hill had to say was an incredibly personal, intimate, but also hopeful, aspirational idea of where we could go.
It also speaks volumes about your parenting. I want to end, first of all, by telling everyone to get this book and to also remind them that there's so much more than we've even managed to cover. The Kavanaugh hearings, all of the voting rights chapters that are so disturbing, Stacey Abrams. But I want to give you a chance to just end with Dobbs, because it happened, obviously, without you knowing exactly that Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned just weeks before your book came out. Just give us a sense of how we should think about that in the context of Lady Liberty.
I mean, I think that all through last year, whether it was SB 8, that Texas vigilante bill, or the oral arguments in Dobbs, which happened last winter, I think it was clear as I was finishing the book that something was changing. And I was in some ways not as surprised by Dobbs as a lot of people. I mean, first of all, we all heard the leak. But I think I also just had a sense that this revanchist, really punitive set of attitudes towards women was coming to the Supreme Court. And I had to, as you say, I had about a week after Dobbs to rewrite huge swaths of the introduction and the epilogue and the chapter, Bridget Amiri's chapter on abortion. So there was a lot of rethinking and revisiting what this all meant. And I think what I wanted to say, and I hope I said it, but I am still struggling with it, is that when we talk about this special relationship that women have with the law, for me, the book opens on crowds chanting at Donald Trump rallies, "Lock her up," right? That wasn't just rhetoric. That was put Hillary Clinton in jail. And then that was repurposed against Nancy Pelosi. We're hearing Donald Trump just saying again that Nancy Pelosi should be locked up. So this idea that women should be locked out for having the temerity to have public voices in public lives and take on positions of public leadership should horrify us. And so what I wanted to do was really land the book on the ambiguity of Dobbs and the idea that women really are going to be locked up now. We're seeing women in jail in Oklahoma, being indicted in Texas, being held in jails in Alabama because they're allegedly endangering their pregnancy. Women being locked up starts as a chant, and it kind of ends post-Dobbs as a reality for women. And it's going to, I think, continue to be a reality for women, not just because, they take drugs during pregnancy or they have a DNC and the state investigates them, but that the idea that somehow the state has the power to determine which women are criminals and which women are free is just deeply radical. And I'm not sure we've processed it yet. And so I wanted the book to end on Dobbs in some sense to make this complicated point, which is I think the law is both the instrument of women's freedom and dignity and also the instrument of our oppression. And that it has been both those things throughout history. It was the thing that is responsible for witch burnings. It's also the thing, that gave us the vote and gave us the ability to work. And so we live on a knife edge, and we always have, we just forgot. And this book, I hope, is a call to say, be on the side of the knife that purposes the law to power and respect and equality and pluralism and tolerance and dignity, and not be on the side of the law that sends us back decades where we have to go to jail because the state doesn't think our miscarriage was legitimate.
Dahlia Lithwick, thank you so much. The book is Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. I hope everyone buys it for Hanukkah. Thank you for being with us, and thank you all for being part of this broadcast in the spotlight. It's always good to be with you, and I'll see you next time.